Welcome to Agile Coaches Corner by AgileThought, the podcast for practitioners and leaders seeking advice to refine the way they work and pave the path to better outcomes. Now, here's your host, coach, and Agile expert, Dan Neumann.
Welcome to the AgileThought podcast. I am Dan Neumann. Our goal here with the Agile Coaches Corner is to bring you Agile topics in an approachable way. So if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss, you can email it to us at podcast@agilethought.com, or you can tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast. I'm excited to have two guests with me today, Barry Matheney and Eric Landis, both fellow Agile thinkers and experts in the DevOps space. And we are here today to talk about DevOps and the importance of having that on Scrum teams. Eric, Barry, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
A lot of times there are barriers, I think, built around, there's the Agile and the Scrum stuff and then DevOps separately. And good thing or bad thing? What do you guys think?
So I'm going to take this, and my take on this and experience with it has been that, we tend to separate DevOps into its own silo. And when we talk about, let's say, Scrum, we want our teams, our development team specifically, to have all the skills it needs to deliver the software. So that's where I want to emphasize, especially with Scrum teams, I want to emphasize you need to have the DevOps skill set on the team, and we can talk about how you get to that point. And that should be a goal, really, for teams. The goal should not to be to have a separate DevOps team, because what I've seen, we tend to throw that software over the wall and leave really some of the things that I believe the team should have investment in to the DevOps team. And so that's where I'm coming from. And what we tend to preach is, we want to embed those skill sets on a team and give Scrum teams and Agile teams that skill set so that they can deliver from the beginning of the life cycle to the end.
Cool. And Barry, what are you seeing when you have well-functioning Scrum teams with the DevOps skill sets embedded in it?
So I think the natural thing that Eric is talking about specifically is you are completely self-sufficient at that point, right? So now then my capability to deliver is not limited by the dependence on other teams or organizations or somebody else on the other side of the wall. And I'm not delivering over the wall anymore, right? Production becomes mine. And I own it, I operate it, I make sure that it gets the care and feeding. I make sure that defects get into my backlog to get prioritized. All of the things that Scrum and Agile teams are set out to do in the first place, right? To make me own the product all the way through to providing that value.
Yeah, so you're ripping out those walls then that might exist.
Yeah, and we've talked previously about things like water, scrum, fall, right? So the analogy is water still the planning, the budgeting, and all that type of thing, and then we go do work in the Scrum manner, and then the fall is when we throw it over the wall to the operations team to do the run part of the idle, right? But if we can just eliminate the fall and just make it water Scrum, we're going to be in a much better place for that product long term.
Well, and as a Scrum guy, I'd say let's eliminate the water part too, and try and get to the point where we're just delivering value continuously and eliminate all those walls. I'm not
arguing with you at all. I'm just talking about taking one piece of the puzzle at a time. I think that's a different audience and a different conversation, right?
Well, right. Well, and you bring up an important point, and Eric would love to get your thoughts on that as well. So one piece of the puzzle at a time. There's a desired state for DevOps and a Scrum team with all the skills necessary to deliver. You'd mentioned owning production, and we'll want to come back to that a bit later, especially in maybe more regulated places. But let's get everything together, but we have to do that in some baby steps in most organizations. Is that how you're seeing things come about, Eric?
Yeah, I would say definitely baby steps, and I would believe actually the DevOps, and I believe Barry and I are on the same page here, but I want to clarify that water part. DevOps should be informing the beginning of the development cycle. So DevOps should be helping give good data about what customers are using. That should be part of what we're delivering when we talk about production, right? We're delivering telemetry, that kind of stuff. So we can go back to kinds of folks and say, here's actual data, here's what our customers are actually using, and you're spending money on these things that maybe they're not using, or those kinds of things. So getting that right, getting that correct can really help that water part of the water scrum fall.
Well, and to pile on that a little bit, I think it even goes a little deeper than that, right? Because if you're building a product, to me, that's the water and the planning and the budgeting. And what you're talking about are the features that I'm adding to this product at this point going to continue to add value, right? So if we have the telemetry and we have the metrics and we have the capability to determine through DevOps practices, different types of testing, target audiences, those types of things, then it becomes it's an affirmation that our tests are running the way we expect them to, and we're going to get the return value that we're looking for.
Right, and I would say though that we should be also influencing that information should not just be influencing features, although that's a large part of it, but it would also influence our product decisions. Hey, we thought X amount of customers would be engaged with this application this time of the day, and it's not meeting our expectations. Now we can affect the budget because we have actual numbers, right? So that's where I was going in saying it should influence that water part of the fall, is that it's not just the feature information, it's giving you actual customer data that should inform product decisions down the line. Again, once you get that set up and you get a baseline, going back to those baby steps you talked about, Dan, is you're not going to do that day one of starting to have a DevOps culture and embedding some DevOps concepts on your Scrum teams.
Right. I think what I hear you two describing are maybe a couple different scenarios. One being a greenfield environment. Barry, I think maybe you were alluding to this, where we maybe don't have anything released yet. So we're setting up a new team, we're setting up a Scrum team with DevOps, and there's more of maybe the water part before the Scrum in what you were describing there. And then Eric, I think maybe what you were describing is after something is released to production, which is hopefully very early and often, then we're starting to collect the information, the telemetry, the metrics about usage, doing split tests, those types of things, and leveraging the DevOps skill to help then inform how we continue forward on that roadmap.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't know what you think, Barry. I mean, one thing I want to point out, because we've talked about this, Dan, before, is the idea that, hey, maybe we don't need to invest more in that feature or even product. And that's where I was going with this, is you're going to have data to make those decisions to say, hey, let's invest over here, not over here. And that investment could be a feature, but I also believe it could be at the product level.
Yeah, and I would also I totally agree with everything that you just said, Eric. And I know that you and I have talked about, the books, the DevOps handbook and those types of things. And one of the most profound most profound statements out of that whole book is that almost 2/3 of features either provide zero or negative value. Right. So are we building the right thing, and do we have the data to make the determination about whether we're building the right thing or not? And the only way to get that is through that experimentation and testing that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a great point, Barry. The experimentation, we've talked about the lean culture and values and those kinds of things. And one thing I like to emphasize is that idea of hypothesis-driven development or experimentation, where, hopefully the DevOps skill set brings that, and the lean thinking brings that to the team. Hey, let's test what we think is going to happen with this feature and get some real data back. And if we have a production mindset, live site mindset, we can actually do that, right? We can say, hey, we think this is going to happen when we release this. Let's release it. Let's test that hypothesis. If it works, great. If it doesn't, we've learned something. Let's take that learning, let's apply it to our backlog and whatever else we have, right?
Absolutely. And we have an episode with Adam Mulry a few episodes back where he talked about the experimental mindset. And so now with the DevOps practices or the DevOps mindset, we're able to take the experimental mindset, actually measure things, and then use that to inform our path forward using that hypothesis-driven development. What are some places maybe where you've seen some really strong positive examples of DevOps? If people are like, okay, I get that we want DevOps on an Agile team, but maybe I'm still having a hard time wrapping myself around what would that look like when it's really being successful?
I have experienced a Scrum team that was doing, really it was machine learning and doing some big data type new greenfield project. And we had a team, a fairly large team with developers, very large Scrum team, and a DevOps role was part of that team, as well as other testers. And that became the basis. The client was very happy with the results because the team was able to get the data models out into their production site quickly. And in that particular instance, they were actually modifying data models constantly. And so being able to deliver frequently was something they had to do in that project. So we actually had all the roles we needed to get out to production on that team. Lots of PowerShell scripting and all that kind of stuff happening, but also feature building. And we didn't have a separate team doing delivery. So that particular client was a success. Barry, I know you have some.
Yeah, I've got a couple actually. So, and I think the more interesting one is the delivery. So this was, I won't call it greenfield, but it was the implementation of a SaaS product. So we built that product and those Scrum teams with that in mind of, we know it's not going to be continuous delivery, but we want rapid delivery. So we built agility, flexibility into the delivery mechanisms. We built test automation. We did all of the best practices, and I think that's a key component here too. It doesn't have to be around just new software, greenfield, any of that type of stuff. You can apply DevOps principles and do practices at any level on any type of application. You could just have to decompose it. It depends on how far you want to go as to what the benefits you're going to get out of it. That one, we wound up in a culture where, deployments were every 3 to 6 months, and we were ready to go. We could have gone weekly if we'd wanted to. So those are huge improvements. And again, I think some of the best stories are, wow, the deployment happened and nobody knew about it. That's exactly what's supposed to happen, right? It got to prod and there was no upset. You just show up and the new feature is there and you're ready to go, right? And those are the best cases.
Absolutely. I love it when, I'll use a Netflix example that I use in a lot of my classes, but when I'm watching Netflix and I go to, view a new series, a TV series. This happened a while back. I said, let's watch this, and all of a sudden it automatically went to the next episode in that series without me having to press a button. I was like, wow, this is amazing, right? And it happened automatically. And that's the kind of thing you're talking about, Barry. And I love it when that happens with our continuous delivery models.
Yeah, and I think another topic that we want to bring up, and it's probably for a completely different conversation, but we need to really start talking about the non-functional aspects. So we've talked a lot about the Scrum team and getting features and delivering business value, but there are also a lot of not necessarily visible benefits such as audit and compliance and security and all of those things being built in from the beginning, deployability, testability, all of those features that aren't features of normal, software delivery products where they become built in and now they are a feature of everything that you're doing.
Yeah, actually, I want to touch on that for a second because, Netflix obviously does some wonderful things. I hear a lot of counter examples with folks when they're like, well, yeah, but we're not a .com, we're not able to release to production because separation of concerns, different environments, different gates they have to go through. And I think it would be helpful for people listening to maybe talk about how DevOps fits into some of these more traditional places. Sometimes it's bigger companies that are just now maybe going to a more agile mindset, and they're really struggling with how do we go to production if we are let's say, an accounting firm of some kind with separation of duties?
We have actually worked with that particular concern, and the concern isn't we want to deliver every 11 seconds like maybe we do on Amazon, right? What you want to do is I want to deliver when I need to. That's what I like to say. So I don't want to be constrained by something that I would say is really an artificial constraint, like, oh, we only deploy on Tuesdays, or we only deploy monthly, quarterly, whatever. Take your pick, right? Whatever your policy is. So let's see if we can remove those constraints. So what are they? And one of our clients, it happened to be around compliance, and that is definitely a valid concern. So it's, let's look at it. I think in the DevOps, looking at this, we're going to look at this as what is the value that compliance brings, and then can we automate it, and how much can we automate the value that's bringing there? So in this case, maybe we're validating something like a build pipeline and making sure certain people can't modify those templates. Can we automate that part of it, not just the build, but can we automate who has access and the compliance part and the auditing part? And I would argue we can, and there's lots of ways to do that. Barry, I know you've got some examples too.
Oh, yeah. So, and just for context, right? So there's continuous integration, continuous deployment, and then continuous delivery. All you can, if you're willing to invest and design your application in a manner that allows it, you can do continuous deployment irrespective of the field or industry that you're in. And I'll just go back to part of the reference material. One of the best things that I heard, and I heard it originally from a Jez Humble thing, was, the real metric is how long does it take you to get a single line of code from check-in into production? And so don't think of it in terms of a feature. Think of it in terms of a zero-day security breach. I need to do it right now because my environment is at risk, right? I can't go through, or I need to minimize as best I can that lead time that it takes to check in that code and get it into production. So I could limit, if I don't do these things, I'm dramatically limiting my business's ability to continue to stay in business, even because they're going to be, security things are probably going to be the one of the biggest reasons that we're going to need to deploy fast anyway. So, and the other thing is single piece, right? So it's a single line of code. How do I deploy that rather than deploying the whole application? So again, a lot of those are architectural design principles. A lot of them are just development best practices. And again, it comes back to, are you a greenfield, or do you have an existing application, and how do I retrofit that, which is kind of where we started. How do you build this in from the beginning, right? Or how do you approach it differently if you're going to be coming into a project that's already established and maybe doesn't have the capability to deliver more than once a month or something like that? So how do you go about that, right?
Yeah, that scenario you mentioned of a security breach or some other compelling business reason to go plug a gap that you have puts a different mindset on it. It's like, yeah, we might not need to release, quote, new features at a high rate of cadence. But boy, if we have a compelling reason we need to get some kind of change out, boy, we better be able to do that.
And there's actually some use cases. Fannie Mae actually had that very problem. They had a 0-day breach and their site was down. And they made decisions, and they had the release capabilities to go in, and they repaired it in almost no time at all, right? And it was a serious breach that we were talking about. So it's not impossible, but again, you have to, if you're not designing for those types of situations, it's going to be problematic, and you're going to have to take exceptions to every rule that you have put in place or implied by not doing best practices necessarily. So something else that you also mentioned, Dan, and I just want to make sure that everybody understands that separation of duties and separation of concerns doesn't mean that a developer can't deploy to prod. What it means is a developer has tools that takes the control of a production environment away from them so that they can't do damage beyond what the intent, right? So again, I have to design a process and design tools. There are tools out there that separate it so that, somebody has to approve and all those kinds of things. Those are all great and fine, but maybe the product owner is the one that says, "Oh, I'm ready to go to prod," push the button and it goes. I don't even have to be a technical person to do those things. So, but it could be a developer if he found a bug and he fixed it. There are lots of companies that are PCI compliant that are doing those types of things.
Have a topic you want us to tackle? Send an email to podcast@agilethought.com or tweet it with the hashtag AgileThoughtPodcast.
You mentioned compliance, and that was exactly where my mind went. For an organization that has to be compliant, is there educating of an auditor that maybe needs to be done if they're having internal or external auditors come in? To what degree are maybe auditors realizing that these things do fit the compliance models versus there's some education or building a case that you have indeed achieved, let's say PCI compliant or insert your framework?
So I would, and Eric can pile in on this too, but I would say that it actually makes compliance and audit easier, because I'm going to, again, from a DevOps perspective, I know what audit questions I have to answer every quarter. Why wouldn't I build that in such that I have that collateral sitting off to the side and I give the auditor a UI to go through to give them the same information that I would have given them anyway, right? So again, it goes back to application design and release pipeline design and those types of features that you design into your continuous delivery practices that facilitate that stuff.
And I would add with the whole idea is, and you really said it, the team is collaborating with the compliance folks. So when we talk about that DevOps skill set, we are saying, hey, we may need the skill set from the compliance folks. And what that may mean is they work with us for a couple of sprints, if we're a Scrum team, to create that automation that helps them. And I agree with you, Barry, on that point, that we definitely can improve the auditor's experience, right? And help them do even a better job, and maybe make them focus on the value they bring rather than digging into code and that kind of stuff to do more, what I would think of as more boring tasks, right?
Yeah, and I think from a level of involvement, time commitment, how do we do this, right? So the Google SRE model is that one SRE for X number of Scrum teams. And what they do is they teach that team to learn how to operate their own services. And from a security and from a compliance perspective, if you have somebody that's involved, maybe they're in for the first 2 sprints or 3 or whatever the number is, and then what you build is a level of trust on that team to know that you're going to build all the security controls, all of the compliance, audit, all of that stuff in every time they do something. And now that they don't have to be involved all the time, right? But there may be new features or new areas that they have to come in to consult on, and they become very consultative for the long term, but their involvement from the beginning should be very, very high, so that we make sure that all those, and I'll call them non-functional requirements, but they are actually functional requirements, because the business can't operate unless we take care of those concerns.
You used the term SRE. Could you elaborate on what that is, Barry?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So it's a Googleism, I guess. There's a role that they have that's called a site reliability engineer. It's effectively a shared group, because again, you don't need necessarily somebody on a Scrum team full time to play that role. So they come in part time, and they mature the service to the point, and it's sometimes 6 months and sometimes it's 3 years, to the point where it becomes operationalist, I guess, if that's a word. It's probably not, but it's probably something more along the lines of it can go into standard operations mode. In other words, we're not enhancing that product anymore, right? So that's when you start to talk about the SRE handing it over to a run organization, opposed to the team owning the product or the production support and the operational support of it.
Perfect. Thank you. So we've talked about the value of having the DevOps engineers working with the Scrum team, or having that complete set of skills and the mindset. What are some sources of resistance that you see? So it sounds wonderful, not everybody's doing it. So there must be some resistance somewhere. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
That's an interest. So the conversation to me is, this is a software delivery problem, right? It's not an operations problem. It's not a development problem. It's not a product problem. It's not a technical problem. It's not a tools problem. But the challenge becomes, and I'm going to use this as an analogy, Dan, and how we take this is, what happens in a lot of software products is we deploy MVP and we get it to production that first time, and we didn't do that and I don't want to use the word hardening, but we didn't do that maturation of the delivery process, and we continue to rely on those immature processes through the life of the product. And so the delivery capabilities are as functional, and that's what I've said before, as the product features themselves. If I can't get the product feature to production in a reliable, consistent way, predictable way, then I've defeated the purpose of what I was trying to get delivered anyway, right? There's pain, and there's the practice becomes challenging. Deployments take days, those types of things, right? So
Yeah.
there's a group of people, that those people that love to learn, they gravitate towards these things. But there are, in certain environments, there are people that have always found their net worth. And this is something that I've always said, DevOps eliminates the hero syndrome, right? So if you have organizations that people thrive off the hero syndrome, that's where you're going to run into your resistance, because you don't need the same number of heroes in a DevOps type of world than you do in others. That's one big example for sure.
What you described brought to mind. So we do cowboy coding, then we do manual testing, and we deploy it into these snowflake environments, and then we pat ourselves on the back because we avoided a disaster again. I mean, that's kind of the mental model that came to mind.
And so, and I love to tell my favorite metaphor is, when we start managing hundreds or dozens or even more than one machine, we need to learn to treat them like cattle. Right? Don't treat them like a pet. I don't want to nurse it back to health. I want to take it out and put another one in that look just like it. So that's the best analogy I've ever heard in my life about treating environments like cattle rather than pets. And I think that goes right to if I'm treating them like cattle and I take one out of commission and put another one in, I didn't need a special set of hero syndrome to make that happen.
Very nice.
I would add to that, Dan, that the resistance I've seen, and this is probably the hardest one from my perspective, is more organizational. So as an organization, we're used to doing things a certain way. We have an ops group and we have this. So now when we have this DevOps group, then, well, certainly that we should have a group, and that should report to, the director of operations or whoever that is. And so we're going to make that a separate group just because of reporting requirements. So organizational resistance is something I've seen, and really getting around that is just showing the power of collaboration. And to Barry's point, hey, we want this to work. We don't want the snowflake environments. We don't want the 30-hour deployments over the weekend. That there's a cost there, right? And so we can measure that, and we can make the argument, yeah, you don't want to do that. Here's why, and usually you get buy-in.
Yeah, so measuring and building your case with some actual facts and data about the cost of doing that. If you're, let's say, needing to be HIPAA compliant, there's cost to having a breach because something went wrong in an environment with your, test data accidentally exposing things or whatever the case might be. So I like using the facts and the data. Well, thank you for exploring the topic of DevOps on Agile teams, specifically Scrum teams is the framework we used for a lot of this conversation. And before we go, I'm curious if you could share, as part of your continuous learning journey, what are some things that you're reading and bringing value to your profession or the way you go about your work these days?
So I'll go first. So I actually, one of the books I just finished was The Age of Agile. I know that I've heard other conversations about that, Stephen Denning, right? I can make a couple of recommendations that if people haven't read, they're right in line with that actually, and actually they marry up Agile and DevOps really well. Probably everybody and their brothers heard of these. So Lean Enterprise, that's the Jez Humble book, how high-performance organizations innovate at scale. And then I would also, if you haven't heard of Nicole Forsgren, she is a PhD with Gene Kim and Jez Humble. They wrote a book called Accelerate: The Science of Lean Software and DevOps, Building and Scaling High-Performance Technology Organizations. And that is a non-technical book. If you're a product owner or leading an Agile team in any way, I would highly recommend that you get a copy of that.
Good. We'll put a link to those different books then into the show notes at agilethought.com/podcast. People can find the show notes there. And then Eric, how about you?
Yeah, great question. I've really been listening to some older stuff, really, just kind of refreshing my mind with Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, kind of a classic, and really just enjoy kind of remembering why that's important and applying that to Agile. And the Pixar story, which to me, really shows somebody using new technology and pushing forward and really kind of, expanding boundaries. So I enjoy that. Not necessarily DevOps heavy at all, but that's what I'm reading.
Yeah, we talk a lot about having T-shaped people on a team, or generalizing specialists, and I find the same thing applicable when it comes to the information people are bringing in, whether it's reading a book or blogs they're interested in or activities completely outside the realm of software delivery and business value. You find these interesting things that tie in and can give you a new perspective. So love the Pixar stories. Well, thank you both for joining me today, and look forward to continuing our conversation on DevOps another day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
This has been the Agile Coaches Corner podcast, brought to you by AgileThought. Get the show notes and other helpful tips from this episode and other episodes at agilethought.com/podcast.